Hi guys, this is Michael. I am a brand designer, and in this video, I'm gonna show you my 6-step process on how I create illustrations. From coming up with your inspiration board, gathering your references, doing your sketches, making the actual illustrations, and then finally bringing this to an actual packaging design. As a brand designer, I do a lot of illustrations for my projects, and I designed these steps to make them as easy as possible to follow along. So for this project, I will do my sketches in Photoshop. The rest of the work will be done in Illustrator, where I do most of my packaging design work. Our friends from Weon sent us the Weon Canvas Pro 16 to help us with the illustration project today. This one has a huge screen, but the tablet is very thin for its size. It comes with a stand and cables that you can use to connect to your computer, and it comes with really nice pens and a bunch of accessories to use. Okay, so let's get started with the very first step, which is to do the creative brief. So before you dive into the actual work, it is important that you have a full understanding of the illustration project. So for this part, you should ask questions like, what is the general vibe that you are going after? What is the vision for this project? Who are the target audience? Is there a specific illustration style that we want? Or even the emotions that you want to convey through these illustrations? Design for me is a problem-solving field. So if you are doing illustrations specifically for labels or packaging, aside from the visual aspect of it, like coming up with a really good looking illustrations, it is also important to note that the output must also fit the needs of the brand, and it must provide solutions for their design problems. So today we are doing a vintage style illustration for bottled drinks. So we want the illustrations to have a classic hand-drawn feel, like a rustic charm. We want to evoke a feeling of nostalgia, and of course we'll complement this with a retro color palette. Some of our key descriptors are authentic, timeless, approachable, and heritage. So the illustrations will play a critical role here because we'll use them to differentiate different flavors in this product line. So in total, we'll be doing 3 flavors for this beverage brand. Another thing that I like about using illustrations is that it adds another layer of interest to the design, especially for something that will be in stores or in supermarket shelves, where consumers usually have like a split-second decision on whether they want to buy something or not. Illustrations can really help a product stand out more against its competitors. And of course, illustrations can make the design more unique to the brand, and it would really reinforce that brand identity. So I'm gonna go over my Weon tablet to get started with the next step, which is to gather inspiration. So my goal here is to get inspirational pieces that I can use to build a style board or a mood board for this project. Right now I am on Pinterest, and I always want to go back to the keywords from the creative brief and use those as my starting point. So let's look for vintage illustrations. I'm still using the pen of the Weon tablet, and I like that I can use one of the buttons for right-clicking, similar to that of a mouse. So as I am scrolling through these images, I'm saving those that I want to use as style references. Since this illustration would go on a packaging, I think it's best to search for vintage packaging references as well. So I get to have an idea of how they do the layout and also how they use illustrations. I also want to look specifically for images of fruits, flowers, like botanicals and farms and other related stuff, and see if I find anything interesting. One tip that I will share here is to also allow yourself to expand your search. So for example, I found this image and it's not necessarily the vibe that I'm looking for, but I am particularly inspired by the layout of this one. So I'm gonna save this as well. Once I've gathered enough references, I then take some of the images and put them in a document to compile them. Now that I have a collection of inspiration, I can then proceed to the next step, which is to build the illustration style. Essentially, what we are doing is sort of like building a style guide. So we specify a set of parameters, set of elements that we want to see in every illustration, such that when we do illustrations, all of them are cohesive and they are consistent to the specific style. Okay, going back to the references we compiled, let's start with the images on the left. Okay, so in this first image, I like that they used outlines, or this line tracing the shapes. They also used parallel lines here to add more details, and the overall effect is this rough texture. This image uses outlines as well. So if we look closely, the lines have tapered ends, meaning it is wide near the base and sharp at the ends. And this one is similar to the first one. As you can see, the main focal point also uses lines, but the background is much softer to create more contrast and give more emphasis to this flower. Okay, so for the images on the right, this first image, I like this kind of offset effect. As you can see here, the white area doesn't really align with the lines, which is something that I would like to try. This image, on the other hand, has like a bounding box, but some elements extend outside this box, and this makes it less rigid in my opinion. And then lastly, we have here an image with a very grainy texture, and I think it adds a lot to the vintage vibe that we are after. Okay, so this next set of images are mainly for color inspiration for the 3 flavors, but as you can see, some of these also have the elements that we mentioned in the first set of images. So when you do your audits, here are some things you can look at. First is lines. Are they sharp? Are they thick or thin? Wavy? Are they smooth or do they taper at the ends? So next is shapes. So are they smooth, sharp or pointy? Or is it unconventional or abstract? The third one is texture. So is it grainy? Is it rugged? Is it a rough texture, or does it have like patches? So things like that. So next, of course, is colors. So are they complementary in the color wheel? Is it monotonous or limited color palette? Do they have like strong contrast, or is it vibrant or dull? And then lastly, we have space or form. So do they use shadows or highlights to introduce more dimension? Is the effect 3-dimensional, or is it just like a flat illustration? So these are the things that you should look at when you do your audits. One of the challenges that I encounter when I do illustrations is starting the work itself. Sometimes it can be intimidating when we are looking at a blank screen. We don't know where to start and what to do. So this step is what you can use to get through that initial hurdle. So what I'll do next is to build a rough composition. So in this step, I look for different placeholder images that I can use and then build sort of like a collage, and then use that as a base or like a guide before making my sketch. I try to estimate the working space and explore different angles, arrangements, and sizes of the elements that will go in the illustration. One advantage of doing this step is it gives me like a foresight of whether a composition works or not even before starting the sketch. So I can see if it has the right balance, if the proportions are correct, if I have utilized the space well. So this step saves me a lot of time in the sketching and illustrating phase because we've already explored a lot of options and then we've narrowed it down to the best composition or arrangement. So when we proceed to the next step, we minimize the trial and error, and in effect, this makes the overall process smoother and more efficient. With the composition done, I like to turn down the visibility of this to around 30%, and then we proceed to the fifth step, which is to do the sketch. For this step, you can either print out the composition, do your sketch using a pencil, scan it and send it back. Or if you are using a graphics tablet, you can create a separate layer and then do your sketches on top of the composition. So let's head over to Photoshop. So the first thing that I'll do here is to create a new layer on top of our composition. Okay, and then once we have a new layer, I'll go to the brush tool. And then I'll try to find a brush that has a similar feel to that of a pencil. If you are using the Huion Canvas Pro 16, you can actually modify the buttons of the pen tablet and the pen itself to make it easier for you to do your sketch. They have a dedicated software to do that, and let me show it to you. So for the pen, you can assign a shortcut for the buttons. The first one, I'd like to set this as the mouse right button, but you can choose other shortcuts as well. The other one, I set this to E because this is the shortcut for the eraser tool in Photoshop. Then aside from that, you can also change the shortcuts for the pen tablet itself. The ones that I use most often are these shortcuts. So we have the letter Z for the zoom button. I also have an undo button. And then I also use the spacebar so I can pan around the workspace. In this part, I'll just show you a quick time lapse of how I did the sketches for the 3 variants. Since we've put a lot of effort in doing a rough composition, it didn't really take me a lot of time to finish the sketches. I will then export this as an image file, either as a JPEG or PNG. I'll send it to Illustrator and do the last step, which is the most important step, which is to work on the illustrations. In doing the actual illustrations, there are actually multiple ways on how you can do it in Illustrator. Probably the most common way is by using the pen tool, where you use multiple anchor points to create the shapes or strokes. When you are using a pen or a graphics tablet, I think the best tools to use are the brush tool, the pencil tool, or the blob tool. So for this project, the approach that I'll be using is I'll start with the outlines first, and then once we are finished with that, I'll do the fills next. So here in Illustrator, select the brush tool. If you double click this, you can adjust this to be more accurate or more smooth. But for this project, I'll just use the default settings. Then let's go here to open the brush settings. These are the default settings, but since we are using a pen tablet, I will change this to pressure and then change this to 3 pixels. So when you set this to pressure, the lines will be thicker the more pressure you apply. But when this is set to fixed, the lines will just be uniform. Once you have adjusted the brush settings, you can now start working on the illustrations. When you are doing the illustrations, always keep in mind the style guide that we created to make sure that everything is consistent to the style that we defined. The shortcut key that I set on the tablet makes it easy for me to undo when I'm not satisfied with the strokes. For the details of these illustrations, I'll do tapered lines similar to our style reference. Sometimes it may be necessary to rotate the artboard, and Illustrator has a rotate view tool that you can use for this. Before I start filling this, I will create a new layer to keep them separate from the outlines. As you can see here, I didn't fill it completely to give that offset effect that we want. I then added a box to contain the illustration, but some elements would extend outside consistent with the style guide. I also added here darker shades to introduce shadow effect. And I added more details to the leaves. Since the lines are in a separate layer, I can target this specific layer. And I want to add a rough look to give a more hand-drawn feel. I will add effect and then go to distort and then roughen. I will set this to absolute with 1 pixel and set the detail to 40. To create the grainy texture in our style guide, I will use these small dots to create a scatter brush. So select these, open the brush window, and select New Brush. Then Scatter Brush. You can then draw inside the shape, and then use this like a normal brush. Just an additional note, to change the color of this, you must change the colorization to tints. And then I'll just apply the grainy texture to the fruits, and this will also be their highlights. I have here this vector file, and I will use this to give a more vintage feel to the background. I will also add another instance of roughen effect. And I just repeated this same set of processes for the other two variants. And here are the final illustrations that I did for this project. Now that I am done with the illustrations, I can now finalize the packaging design for the 3 bottles. This is the final look for the packaging design that we did today. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you find this helpful, please do hit the like button and subscribe. And you may also follow me on Instagram at michael.lubrin. If you want to purchase a Huion Canvas Pro 16, I have a link below in the description. And thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next video.